Okay, we're live on YouTube. Okay, everybody, welcome to another Brown Girls in the Rain book club. This is book club number 10, and we're doing The Secret Path.
Yeah, you want to show them the book? Secret Path by Jeff Lemire and Gord Downie.
Okay, so are you going to do the rundown or am I?
Yeah, I'll do the rundown. So for this episode of the Brown Girls in the Brain book club, we read The Secret Path by Gord Downie and Jeff Lemire. It's the story of Chanie Wenjack, who was a young Ojibwe boy who was taken from his home in Ogoki Post in Ontario and forced into a residential school over a period of 3 or 4 years. And eventually he decides to run away from the school because of all the years of abuse that he received from the administrators and staff there. But unfortunately, he froze to death on his travel back home. So this was a story that was told in the form of a children's book and was published a few years ago, and it was one of Gord Downie's last projects prior to passing away. It's a very beautiful story, very sad story, I have to say. But I feel like it's very important that they use the story to teach kids about residential schools in the Canadian public school system. What did you think about the story, Anika?
I thought it was a beautiful thing. It was complemented by the music. The music made the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely the music added depth to the story.
Encouraging story. I like how it ended, where he reaches out to his father, and then he kind of looks back and sees his body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could really feel how much he loved his father and the fact that his father was almost like a guiding spirit trying to shine his way back home. And unfortunately, he couldn't get to him. But in the final panel of the story, it shows Chanie's spirit sort of reuniting with his father in the end. And even though it was sad, I felt like this was the only way this story was going to end on a good note, even though it's tragic. Anika, I know you said you learned about residential schools right now with your program. Do you want to shed some light on what you know or what you've learned?
Okay. So residential schools. It was basically they took residential schools was where white people, like the ICP, went in and took children age 6 to basically starting at age 6. They took them to these schools where they're basically being assimilated. The purpose was to assimilate them, to get the savage Indian out. And through these schools, they were beaten, sexually abused. They were not allowed to speak their languages. They were not allowed, even if they were there with their siblings, they weren't allowed to talk to their siblings. And then at 18, they basically let go. Like they're like, okay, you have to figure out what you're doing with your life.
Mm-hmm. And all of this is done as an effort to destroy the the Native American and Indigenous culture within Canada.
And what was I saying? Oh, the last one closed in 1996.
Yeah.
I might be echoing because we're on IG Live as well.
Yeah, so when I was in elementary school, I don't think they ever taught us anything about Indigenous rights or just anything in regards to the Aboriginal people of Canada. It was something that if you had interest in it, you needed to search out that information on your own. It wasn't going to be taught to you. So I didn't learn about the residential school system until I was practically in university when I took a class that mentioned it, and it shocked me to learn that the Canadian government actually forcibly removed Indigenous children from their parents and made them go to these schools where they weren't allowed to speak their own language, where they weren't allowed to practice their own religion. It all had to be done. They all had to basically forget who they were at home and sort of adapt to this new white cultural identity. And it's one of the key concepts of assimilation, but in a lot of ways it didn't succeed. What the Canadian government tried to do did not succeed. The fact that these Indigenous kids that were brought up in residential schools, it was almost like they were stuck between two different cultural identities, being white and being Indigenous. The white society of Canada at that time was not going to accept these kids into their society without an ounce of racism. That just wasn't going to happen. But at the same time, these kids can't fully go back to being who they were prior to the school because they had been in these schools for so long. But
that's the thing. So a lot of kids who went to these schools, their parents went to these schools.
And their grandparents
went to these schools. Yeah, their parents didn't know any better. They're like, that's the only way.
Mm-hmm. And we also have to add, there's this question of that people have been asking, why you as a parent would let your kids go through the same type of abuse as you. But we also forget that these parents were threatened with jail time. It would have been an illegal act for them to keep their kids at home and not send them to the school. Like, they were threatened with jail time. So they might be able to keep their kids at home, but if they go to jail, their kids are going to still go to the residential school anyway. So they really had no choice.
Exactly. And I know a lot of times people fled to go to the States. But when they get caught, then they're just brought back.
Yeah. And I have to say that Chanie's story about running away, he's not the only one who did that. And he's also not the only one who died trying to escape. This is the story of many Indigenous children who have tried to escape and weren't able to make it back home, especially when you consider that their homes were thousands and thousands of miles away. The Canadian government actually made it a law to take them away from their homes as far as possible. A lot of the kids that were being taken were from these remote communities where you can't even like drive up there. You can't take a train up there. You have to actually fly in. So there was no way that even if they did run away, they're not going to be able to make it back home.
Yeah. And for the kids who didn't escape, or also some kids escaped, but they kept getting brought back. So like they tried to escape multiple times and kept getting brought back. But for the kids who never tried to escape, residential schools had a lasting effect on them. That trauma that they're going through, and it's generational. Like, if they didn't go to residential school and their parent went or their grandparent went, they still have those lasting effects.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these kids, these survivors of residential schools, they have difficulty showing love or showing like their emotions and stuff because they weren't allowed to as kids.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have their parents there to like give them a hug or to show them love. Or the thing is, even if their parents brought them up until they went to residential school, their parents went to residential school. They also had that trauma. They didn't know how to offer love to their child.
Mm-hmm. I was listening to an interview that Chanie's sister did with CBC, and she actually made a point that was related to this, in that a lot of the times the only type of love you would ever get was the love from another child, because they weren't getting that from the administrators or their teachers. The only type of love, affection that they would ever get would be the one that they'd get from their friends. Yeah.
Lawmakers and politicians publicly and proudly stated that the best possible goal is to completely get rid of the Indigenous population culture. So the goal was very clearly identified.
Yeah, genocide, very, very clearly. Although genocide as a term didn't come about until I think World War II during the the Nuremberg trials, which is what they tried to label what happened with the Jewish community. At the time that this was being done to the indigenous community, they weren't seeing this as like the death of a culture or a death of a people. They were seeing this as manifest destiny. Like, this is what we're gonna have to do in order for indigenous people to lose their rights to the land that they rightfully own. Like, the whole point of the residential school system was so that indigenous people wouldn't know what their rights were, right? So they wouldn't be able to contest the government with like all the land that should rightfully belong to them.
Let me see. So in this book, it highlights how their heads were shaved when they got to the school, which that's taken part of their identity. Your hair in their culture is a lot.
Yeah, hair in indigenous cultures has a lot of significant meaning, and to cut that off first, like on their first days, it's traumatic.
They were put to shame, just stripped in their clothing, and forced to shower in the communal shower.
Mm-hmm. They also put that medication that you use when you're trying to get rid of lice on their first day, as if like implying that where they're coming from is dirty, and that they have lice, so it needs to be removed.
And sometimes they use kerosene, like oil on their hair, like oil that's used to fire.
Another thing I want to say is that this residential school system did a really horrific job in making people forget that their own blood relations. Like, so you would have families where more than one sibling would be at a residential school, but they weren't allowed to talk to each other. They weren't allowed to have that relationship. It was almost just like, yeah, that's my sibling, but it's almost like there's no difference between them and the other person next to them. There wasn't an environment where sibling relationships could be fostered. That's why, on a side note, we want to mention that Chanie, Wenjack's sister, I think only 3 of them remembered him, but the rest didn't have that relationship with him. Even the ones who remembered him didn't have that sibling relationship with him because they weren't allowed to at the school that they were going to.
Yeah. Say he started at 6, or I don't know if his sister's like younger or older.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. What's this question? Yes.
Yeah.
The song for Instagram people, is what's written in the book the same as the new movie with the music? So essentially it's not lyrics. So yes.
Yeah, it's 100% the same.
In fact, I think a little bit more than watching the main movie because you get like the full songs.
Mm-hmm. I also want to make mention of the fact that once the kids get enrolled in these schools, they lose their name. They lose their name and they have to adopt a number. They're automatically referred to as a number from that day forward. So you're further dehumanizing these kids by not letting them talk. Ooh, I don't have headphones. Maybe I can try this. No, I don't have headphones. I lost my headphones. Is it echoing on my end? No, I lost my headphones. Oh my gosh, where did all these people come from? But yeah. That's
left in the chat on Instagram. So I don't know. Should we just quit the Instagram?
Yeah, let's just quit Instagram. Okay. For those of you on Instagram, if we're gonna be leaving Instagram too because we have technical issues on my side, but go follow Anika's YouTube channel, which is on the link on her IG page and my page actually, and then we can continue the conversation from there.
Go into either of our links in bios and continue this conversation with us. Okay? All right, back to brass tacks. Yes. So we were saying
that was interesting. But so I ended up reading another book to give myself more context about the residential school system. And I learned that like they did a really good job of like making it into a place where people can't have relationships with each other. Like the boys and girls were kept separate. They weren't allowed to talk to each other within their own languages. Like even if they got caught doing that, they would be punished. Like something like the administrators would come in with like a bar of soap and actually wash their mouth out with soap if they were caught speaking their own language. Almost like it makes me think about like that term that people say, like if you swear you gotta wash your mouth out with soap, like almost equating their language with like a bad word almost.
Mhm.
And I was reading this article about this young woman who graduated from the residential school and then went back home, and then everywhere around her, everyone was trying to speak Anishinaabe, and she was upset because she said, I don't want you guys speaking that language to me. Like, I'm better than this.
Mhm.
And she regrets that now to this day. But it kind of made people think that like their language was like backwards. Like being able to speak in your language is
Savagery.
savage. But like I feel that way sometimes too. Like me not even being in residential school, like me like going out in the world and speaking English, but my first language isn't English, it's Tamil, but I'm not encouraged to speak my mother tongue in the world that we're in right now. It's like whenever you get that person who, their English isn't as good, their English is like a second language and they're learning to speak it, you always get that attitude like, why don't you speak English?
You see, that is why when I come across, like for example, at work, a lot of times like our cleaners are foreign, so their English isn't the best, or like even some of them might not speak much English at all. But like when they ask me a question, they get like, you can tell they're getting frustrated or they're getting embarrassed with their English. But like I encourage them, I'm like, no, like we'll take the time. I'll try and figure out what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And like you can tell like that makes the world a difference for some people. Like just being able to have somebody there and listen to them and like take the time to try and understand them and not like diminish them for that.
But that attitude or like that aggression that's shown when people are mad that other people don't have like a great grasp on English, it stems back to colonialism, in the fact that like these white settlers came to this country and wanted to do everything in their power to make sure that people lost their mother tongue and that they should only speak English. That aggression stems back to colonialism, but people now don't realize that because we don't have the education or the wherewithal to think in that way.
Yeah.
Like honestly, like sometimes when like I see people go up to other people and say like, this is Canada, you have to speak English. Well, I'm like, well, who says that the original language of Canada is English? You had all these, there were all there prior to like Canada being settled. Canada was home to like more than like 200 indigenous languages.
Yeah.
So if anything, we should be learning their language, but that's not going to happen now because a lot of these languages are dead because of the whole residential school system.
Or either it's dead, but like I feel like it's coming back because people are realizing what was taken away from them and realizing that no, like we're trying to decolonize ourselves. So
Yeah.
they're learning their cultures, they're learning their language.
There's actually university courses you can take where it's teaching people how to speak certain indigenous languages. Like you can learn how to speak Mohawk, you can learn how to speak various other languages if you take these classes through university. It's another way of people like trying to decolonize what they went through.
And honestly, at think a huge part of like decolonization for us as not being indigenous, whether you be like the colonizer if you're white or if you're like another minority but not indigenous, a huge part that I believe is what most places are putting into effect, where you're acknowledging the land that you're on
Mm-hmm.
and like acknowledging that the places that you get, that the white people or whoever give names to, that they actually had other names, or maybe that the name that they gave it is based off of an indigenous name. For
Yeah.
example, Toronto, the indigenous word for Toronto is Takaranto or something like that.
Toronto, Mississauga.
Hmm.
Even
Like,
the city that we live in right now, all of this where it's like Pickering, Ajax, Durham region, all of this used to be indigenous land.
yeah, there's a website that was given to us in class that you can put in where you are and it'll tell you what land you're on, like
Hmm.
what indigenous land you're on.
Just I have a local story to tell you, but just like 30 minutes up from where we are, if you go up Brock Road and towards Third Concession, there used to be a site there called the Wendat site, and that used to be home to an area where um, archaeologists found a lot of like tools and materials belonging to the Wendat people.
Hmm.
And it existed there for a long time, that site. It was preserved there for a long time, but then um, Pickering wants to build an airport there in that area. So all of that material, all of those tools were excavated and put somewhere else. So it goes back to that saying when,
I find it funny that my phone suggests my own live to me. It's telling me to join my own live.
well, I sent you a request on live.
For YouTube?
I see, not for YouTube,
No,
for
I'm
IG.
saying like
Oh,
my phone is requesting, like it's showing me the YouTube to go check it out. I'm like, I'm currently doing it, phone.
but yeah, Anika, I was saying like there used to be a site up on Brock Road where it was a preserved indigenous site where they found like tools and other artifacts belonging to the Wendat Nation. But then they decided that like the city decided that they wanted to build the Pickering Airport in that area, so all of the site had to be demolished. And I think they took the tools and donated them to the ROM. But it goes back to that saying that like these lands belong to indigenous people, but the government isn't respecting the rights that these people have towards their land. Even like these ancient sites, these burial sites, or these sites where people have been known to be living and it's their ancestral lands, the government can come in at any time and just bulldoze right through that land.
Yeah. And like that's the thing. It's just as simple as having a conversation or like figuring it out, negotiating with people. If if I'm indigenous and you're not, or you're coming from the government, there has to be like a medium where we can meet in the middle and discuss it. So say like if I'll be like, okay, like this is my heritage, like my land, my people's land. I understand you want to build XYZ. Is there some way that we could meet in the middle where we can find a way for you to respect our lands and for you to still get somewhat of what your goal was? But
Yeah,
no, it's just take everything, screw you.
yeah. And yeah, the indigenous people are always left on the bad side of things. They never benefit from these projects that the government does to build on their land, but it's not like they're employing the indigenous people to come in and work on that project. They're just not. Yeah, I did read an interesting article though a while ago, and it was about how in the States a lot of casinos are owned by like Native Americans.
Here too, Casino Rama.
Well, they're actually so some of these casino owners have actually banded together and used their profit to buy back land, like actually purchase land and have it be used as like something for their community.
Hmm. That's good.
But with the US government, they're doing as much as possible to block the sale of these lands, like to block the indigenous people from buying their lands. They fully were like, you can't buy this land if the profit was made from a casino. I'm like, why?
Once again, America trying to control.
America. Yeah. Another thing is like I said, I didn't learn about this in school. I was a full-grown adult in university, and I learned about this in a class that I took. But I believe that they're trying to do this now with introducing the secret path as a teaching tool in schools, but they could do a lot more to improve what they teach about the Indigenous people's history in Canada, apart from colonization, like pre-colonization, colonization, and post-colonization. I was actually in a class with someone, and they said that they had no idea that Indigenous people still existed after colonization.
So they just thought that the white man's goal actually fully succeeded to just wipe them out?
Yeah. He thought that,
Do they think the Indigenous people are cavemen?
Huh?
Do they think the Indigenous people are cavemen?
No, they actually thought that this person,
that far back.
He genuinely thought that the Indigenous people died out and that they no longer existed anymore. But think about it, in the way that we learn things in school, if you hadn't searched out that information about what happened to Indigenous people in after colonization and in modern times, would you know? The schools aren't, especially schools in the 90s, they're not going to teach you that stuff.
I mean, yes, before I learned about it in school, I knew that there was Indigenous people, because the whole idea of Indigenous people being on reservations, like that's a thing, like that's knowledge that we know. Like that's knowledge that is talked about in a negative way, but even though it's a negative way, we know about it because we hear people complaining about, like, oh, the Indigenous people are drunks. Oh, the Indigenous people don't have to pay taxes on cigarettes and stuff. The Indigenous people this, the Indigenous people in the casinos. Like, so because of that, you know that there are Indigenous people.
But as a young child, I don't know. I never heard about Indigenous people. Me in my household, I never heard about Indigenous people until I came across them in elementary school, and that was just to learn about it from the whole Christopher Columbus came to the North America and discovered it, and there were people here already. That's how I learned about it, but not in the modern sense.
Oh, so did you think that in Teachers College they have a whole course on Indigenous ways of knowing and teaching? TC learned it in school.
Oh, it's there.
Like, you mean in elementary and high school, Vic? And you obviously know where we went to school. Just down the road from you.
So in high school, Vic, they taught you that? That's very interesting to me too, as well, because you went to a Catholic school, right?
Yeah, wait, that's true. You went
Right? Because she went to a Catholic school, so
the Catholic people who were doing all this.
Yeah, and it was the Catholic people. Well, mostly Catholic people who were running the schools.
Not mostly. It was the Catholic.
It was
Catholic Church running it.
It was the government. So it was government funded, but they turned it into the hands of the church to run, right?
Yeah.
Oh, there was one topic that was touched.
And there was no separation between church and state. It's like the government funds the church.
Yeah. I sometimes forget just how many Indigenous people are very Christian, like very religious in that way.
Vic got it in elementary school.
There was one topic in the book that was briefly touched upon, but I think the way they did it really sent an impact to me, and it was the fact of the sexual abuse that happened in these schools. There was like a panel where like a Catholic priest, I think it was a Catholic priest, who walked into their room and he reached out a hand as if like he was going to touch Chanie.
Yeah.
While they were in bed, and this was something that was swept under the rug for many years. And oftentimes, even if kids did speak out against what was happening to them, to the school administrators, they would still be the ones who get punished for lying.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, these priests would say, you're gonna let me do this to you, and you're not gonna talk about this with anyone, or else God will punish you. Not be able to talk about this with anyone, not even their own family.
A lot of times they were paid off with chocolate bars.
Mm. Or just like they were just like in fear of being punished more than they were being right now.
Yeah.
And there wasn't that much support for them out there, and this was another thing that added to all these years of trauma that the Indigenous community has gone through. And I think they were trying to address it through what was it called, the Truth and Reconciliation Act,
Yeah.
which was I don't remember when it was established, but it was like established a few years ago at least. And
2015.
they tried to research and collect data about the effects of the residential school system, and they tried to figure out just how many kids went missing during the time that these schools were running. And I think they calculated up to 6,000 kids that went missing,
Mm-hmm.
which that's mind-boggling, like 6,000 kids in Canada, but at the same time, people shouldn't be surprised, I guess. This has always been this country, but we just don't address it.
The thing is,
I
like,
think
with the Truth and Reconciliation, some of the survivors were compensated with money, which obviously money could not, money
yeah.
can't like make up for the trauma that they went through.
I,
However,
I think the government gave them like overall $2 billion as part of this whole Reconciliation Act, but you can't put an amount
yeah,
on trauma, right? Especially when it's trauma over all these years from like the 1800s.
but that's the thing. So like some people, obviously the trauma comes down through generations. So when it gets to certain points, like you still have trauma and effects of it, but like those people are not getting compensated, as well as after the end of the residential schools, they started to do like the 60 scoop where they were taking the kids and putting them into foster care and adopting them out. So those kids were having the same like repercussions, but they were not being compensated for that.
Yeah.
When
Same thing
these
was
kids
happening to them, but just under a different name.
yeah, like they're being ripped out and like adopted out to white families.
Hmm. Yeah, because I think it was like the social workers at that time thought that they would do better in the Canadian school system if they were apart from their native families.
Well, it's the whole assimilation thing. If you're
Hmm.
being raised by white people with no way to like see the others, like everything's just gonna be wiped out.
Hmm.
You're essentially white.
Yeah. I mean, the residential school system is only just like one aspect of all the issues that are affecting Indigenous people today, but it's one of the most
Prominent.
important ones, I feel, because it links back to cultural identity and the fact that it was taken from a lot of these people.
Hmm.
And how do you take cultural identity away from from your people? Take your parents away, take you away from your home.
Take you away from your language, your siblings,
Hmm.
humiliated by having things done to you.
Yeah. Another so another I read a
And
story about how
their food wasn't good, so they're like basically just nourished enough to survive.
well, that's the thing. At least in the I think one of the studies done on the residential school system near the end of the system, it mentioned that at least 25% of all the kids who were attending at this one particular school were underfed and malnourished.
Hmm.
And and it was because the funds that were going towards these schools wasn't being used towards feeding the kids. The
Nope.
funds were really mismanaged. And I read another article about how this one guy, their school really suffered with getting food to the students. And he remembered walking past the staff room one day,
Yeah,
and
and
he
they had
looked
the best
in, and they had the best food. They had like chicken and steak, and they were eating like a feast.
dessert.
But these kids had literally had to like eat mush every day, and sometimes you wouldn't even get enough of that. Like a lot of these kids were known to like run down to the pantry and steal food. It's not stealing if it's their food; it's going towards them. But they had to do that in order to survive. Or they would go to
They only got, like, a proper meal once a week, which was on was it Fridays? So you get fish and whatever, but, like, even then, it wasn't the best meal.
and a lot of the times, like, these kids would run away because they were hungry, so they would run away from the school and go to, like, the neighboring houses and knock on the doors that they knew these people were nice enough to give food and get, like, the scraps from the house fed to them that way.
Mhm. But a lot of times when they try that, then they just get found out
Mhm.
and taken back and beat,
Yeah, like, they'll always get punished for whatever they do,
and the
and I read
authority
about
was
one
always out to try and get them.
I was watching a interview that Chanie Wenjack's sister did about her time in the residential school, and she was mentioning one of the forms of punishment would be to take the little kid and put them in this little room the size of, like, a box, and they'd have to sit in there for, like, sometimes, like, hours, sometimes days, and they wouldn't get food. They would just have to sit there
Like
like time
solitary
out.
confinement.
Yeah, a solitary confinement, but they wouldn't even be let out to use the washroom, so they'd be peeing or, like,
Yeah,
excreting in there, and then the kid would be let out, and then the next kid would be let in, so they wouldn't even clean out the little confinement area for the next kid.
the thing is, the kids
And
probably, like,
these
die
were
in there too.
church-run schools. These were church-run schools.
That's another thing, the indigenous were having their religion taken away from them and forced into this other religion.
Mhm. Yeah, but, Christianity has a history of doing that all over the world.
It's true, it's true, the whole missionary thing.
Yeah. Like I told you, that's how my dad's side of the family ended up being Christian because, um, they had to go to a Christian school in order to get education, but in order to attend that school, you had to convert, right?
Mm.
Right, and so this is, like, my grandma started with my grandma's generation, and it just filtered down. But that's, like, a fairly normal thing to happen over there, forced conversion.
Well, yeah, because 'cause I've heard stories too of, like, other Tamil people where they're Hindu or whatever, but then they go to the Christian school for school because it's the better school. So
Mhm.
they basically have to, like, hide and keep their Hinduism or they actually
Yeah.
convert.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I want to tell you, there's this weird association with, like, Christian schools or, like, just, like, Christianity and modesty, but prior to these Christian schools being built in Sri Lanka, there was a different concept of modesty back in the day. With Sri Lankans, like, it would be completely normal prior to 1900s just to have your boobs out,
Mhm.
like, just to walk around without your boobs or, like, you'll have, like, a sarong but it's completely normal just to walk around with no shirt on because it's so hot there, right?
Yeah.
But then once these Christian schools started getting set up, like, you weren't allowed to do that anymore. Everyone had to wear, like, a certain modest attire, right, in order to go into the schools. And I saw
Mhm.
that with the book here. Not to say that, like, the indigenous children uh, weren't weren't modest when they came in. It was the fact that, like, certain clothes that their parents made that was from their culture, from their family, they weren't allowed to wear those clothes anymore. They had to automatically adopt to what the white men deemed was appropriate for them.
Yeah, like that thing you had sent me about when interviewing his sisters and stuff. Didn't they say that their mom had got them these beautiful dresses and they wore it to the school and they got it taken away from them and sold or burned?
Yeah, she made them silk dresses to wear, and then once they got to the school, they had to get rid of all the things that they brought from home.
Yeah, because they had to wear their uniform.
Yeah, they had to wear their uniform. Even in another book that I was reading, um, even just to have like public religious meetings between indigenous people, like have like public religious ceremonies or cultural events, that those were prevented from happening legally up until like the late 1800s. So for many years indigenous people couldn't even go out and just like celebrate their culture, not in a public way at least, or else they would be jailed. Let me get the dates on that actually.
This book reminded me a lot of this novel I read last year,
Mhm.
Five Little Indians.
Oh, I wanted to read that book. How did you feel about it?
I loved it. It was a good book.
It's nonfiction or fiction?
It's fiction.
And what's it about?
These five kids who went to the same indigenous school,
Mm-hmm.
and then it basically tells their stories and like how they intertwine with each other. So it starts like
Mm-hmm.
when they're in the indigenous school, and then it follows them as they become adults.
And the author themselves is indigenous too. Like, how did they do the research for the story? Did they talk with indigenous school survivors?
I'm pretty sure that they are indigenous. Michelle Good is the author's name.
Oh, on a side note, so I know you guys are aware that of what happened at the Capitol in the U.S. this week with the Trump supporters sort of going on a rampage and attacking the Capitol. And a lot of the Canadian news outlets here were just like, look at what's happening in the US. This could never happen here. And people automatically responded with what happened in, I think it was Nova Scotia a few months ago with the Micmac fisheries coming under attack by these white nationalists and the police doing nothing to step in. And that was here. That was just a few months ago, right? They were literally like these white nationalist groups were actually setting fire to these Micmac fisheries over, and I don't remember what the argument was, but it was over land rights or fishing rights. And
because
the
they're saying
RCP,
that they're saying that the indigenous people get to fish when the commercial ones are cut off, but it's because it's their livelihood.
it's their livelihood, exactly. But all this was going on, and the RCMP did nothing to interfere. Like they literally were trying to put these fisheries on fire.
Are you honestly surprised?
I'm not surprised.
The history of the RCMP was to keep indigenous people in line.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's what they were used for.
that's not going to
Yeah.
change. The only way to change is to disband the RCMP and get something
Yeah.
new.
But they're not going to do that.
Because you can't have something that has such a history and just expect it to change.
No, you can't unless you dismantle it and retrain everyone.
Yeah.
But yeah, like what I was trying to say is that anytime something happens in the US that's crazy, people here are always just like, well, that could never happen here. It happens here all the time.
Yep.
But just people don't pay attention to it. There's not enough energy that's being devoted towards what's happening with indigenous people in this country. Even just a few years ago,
Other people too.
there was this whole thing with a statewide emergency being declared on all the reservations because of all the high number of indigenous youth who were committing suicide. And I can't remember what year this was, but it was definitely within the past decade. How, did we hear anything on the news afterwards about what was going on, what was being done to remedy the situation? No.
The author, she's Cree and she's also a lawyer.
Okay. What's her name?
Michelle Good.
What's her name? Michelle Good. Okay. I'll check it out.
She's a member of
I heard a lot of good things about that one.
Saskatchewan. Oh wow.
Oh, she's Canadian.
The book only came out last year. I'm surprised I got it so soon.
No, it was up for a lot of awards this year, especially with Goodreads and everything.
I'm trying to think. I think I bought that book at work. That must be how I got it, because I don't really go out.
And I benefit from you working. I benefit from you working at the store because I've gotten books through you.
I know. Divvy still needs to get that other book. Ties That Tether. She keeps forgetting.
You hear that, Debbie? She called you out. I don't know if I told you this story before. I probably have because I've talked about it a few times. There's this whole thing with like Thunder Bay, how there's a history of like the cops taking indigenous youth or homeless people and driving them outside of the Thunder Bay for miles and miles and then beating them up and then leaving them there to walk back into the city. And this would sometimes happen in the dead of winter too. So they're increasing the chance that the person's not going to be able to come back home alive at least. And the indigenous community couldn't do anything about it because it's the cops that's doing it to them. Who are they going to report it to? The cops? The cops aren't going to report on the cops.
The Starlight Tour.
Mm-hmm.
That must be the same kind of thing you're talking about.
Starlight Tours.
Liar.
Yeah. Thanks, Vic. I got the town mixed up, but yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
As you're looking
it's called the Saskatoon freezing deaths. Yeah, it's a series of 3 deaths in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in the early 2000s. Their deaths were caused by members of the Saskatoon Police Service who would arrest Indigenous people, usually men, for alleged drunkenness and or disorderly behavior without cause at times. They would then drive them to the outskirts of the city at night in the winter, take their clothing and abandon them, leaving them in sub-zero temperatures. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Thanks, Vic. Yeah, so there's this history of tension between the Indigenous people and the cops. And I bet you the last people that the Indigenous people in this country are going to call are the cops because of this whole negative relationship between each other. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, Vic, that it took them over 10 years.
Have you ever seen a book that was like this big, like this shape?
A children's book, yeah, they usually come that big.
I've never seen a book like this. I don't think you realize the size of this book. Like, this book is literally, it's a record.
Well, it makes sense.
Of a record.
It makes sense though because it's also supposed to be like an audiovisual album, right? Oh, Anika, didn't the school you go to have a theater that's named after Charlie Wenjack?
Yeah.
Did you know the story prior to reading the book?
Yeah. I knew what they had told us when I was in first year, a long time ago, back in 2010, was that the theater was named after this Indigenous boy who he escaped residential schools, but on his way home, he died.
Mm-hmm.
See? Vic says so too. Exactly, Vic. That's when going to school is how I learned about Wenjack originally. And that when you go in the theater, like, I guess in the moment I didn't realize it because I didn't really know the history and stuff, but now, like, knowing what I do and looking back, inside they had a lot of like Indigenous nods. Like they tried really hard to highlight the Indigenous cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. Cause
Oh, is that true?
No. It's true what she's saying, but like how they'd say that. Cause on campus they had like a short set of tracks, and like I swear people said like, oh, like those are tracks that he had died, but obviously not, cause that was in Peterborough.
Well, that's another thing I had trouble finding out where in what exact area he actually died in. It wasn't very easy to figure out, like.
I feel like if he actually died on those tracks, that there'd be a lot more information to say. Trent University, there are these railroad tracks.
Or those tracks probably don't even exist anymore. You never know. Very interesting though. Thank you, Vic. But yeah, the story actually just makes me so sad. Even I think I enjoyed watching the animated video, the animated movie more than the book, because having the music playing in the background and then watching the sequences all together, it just adds something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe the train track is like, maybe it's part of the original train track where he was found, and they just brought it to where you guys were at school.
Maybe. Deserves more digging.
Mm.
Figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, so CBC did a bunch of documentaries and like little short films based on the secret path, and I think one of them was they filmed a book club in one of the Toronto prisons, and they were discussing the secret path and what it meant to the prisoners there, and a lot of them really clicked with it, and also a lot of the guys that were part of this prison book club also had Indigenous background or roots, and they were able to identify with it in a way that they couldn't with other books. And goes back to saying like representation is important too, right? It's good to have diversity in the stories that you're telling so that more people can connect with what they're reading. Anika, are you looking up something?
Yeah. I'm trying to fix the brightness of it. Continue, because this is not working.
Well, did you watch the clip that I think I don't know if I sent you this one, the one with them in the prison, and they were talking about the books, and just like people were relating to different aspects of Charlie's story. Some who were Indigenous and some who weren't even Indigenous were still relating to that story, and I also saw that with Gord Downie, who helped write the book.
Yeah.
Even though he's not Indigenous himself, there was a part of himself. He was dying from cancer at the time, who really related to Charlie's desire to go back home at all costs. And I thought that was the most beautiful part of the documentary that we also watched too.
And the thing is, like, obviously Gord Downie is like a huge name, but he did a lot for this project, but a lot of people still don't know about it.
Yeah. But he did give it momentum though.
Yeah, he did amazing.
Yeah.
Project. It's just that a lot of people, I don't know if it's lack of not caring or just what, but a lot of people just don't know.
Well, that's why I always say these things need to be taught at the school level, because right now with adults pick and choose what they want to pay attention to, but with schools and kids going to schools, like they don't have the choice but to learn, right? I also want to go back to saying more about Gord Downie. He was very respectful in the way that he presented the story. I also like the fact that he asked permission from Chanie's family prior to going public with the graphic novel as well. Like he wanted to make sure that they were okay with it and they liked it. He actually flew into Ogoki Post to meet with his sisters, and he actually visited Chanie's gravesite. Right? I feel like in most cases, like you don't get people who care that much that they're gonna ask for permission from the deceased person's family to showcase their story. But he cared enough to the extent that he actually formed a relationship with his family, right? He brought them to all the concerts that he had for the Secret Path. And I think in the end, like right after the animated movie or the Q&A section of the movie, he actually got honored by the Ojibwe indigenous community, and it was very, very moving to see that happen.
And with this project, it was the first time he ever did like a performance with animation behind it at the same time. Because
Mhm.
yes, they did the film, the short film, but he presented it live like that too, where he did
Mhm.
the music live with the animation behind him. So that
Yeah.
was pretty good because obviously he's used to performing with the Tragically Hip, but this was a
Yeah.
lot different.
Yeah, because 'cause they're not I don't think he was used to performing with, like, paying attention to timing. Because
Mhm.
usually when you're
They just
he's,
go
like,
and
part of the
vibe.
rock band, you just, like, vibe, right?
Yeah.
But for this, he had to make sure that he was in time with the animation going on behind him. And, like, I just really like the fact that he cared, about it so much that he wanted to make every little thing perfect.
Was that the one I
Oh,
sent you,
another
or you looked at another video, Greg? Because I don't remember which one I sent you.
Another thing that I thought was really moving when this was in the live concert, so they actually had left a seat empty for Chanie Wenjack as if, like, he was there watching with them, and it just, like, it really puts into emphasis that this was the person that should have been here, but for no reason at all, he was gone.
Yeah.
Even, going back to, like, the graphic novel itself, the graphic novel does a really good job of illustrating what it was like at the
School.
residential school. It was, like, all black and white and muted colors, very, very dark, very great colors, like, so
The only color
you
that you
could actually
see
see.
is memory.
Yeah. The only color that you see is, like, the fire and then the light at the end where he reunites with his father in spirit.
And his
Yeah.
memories too, like when his memories of being with his dad fishing.
Mhm. So, like, it was a clear difference between when he was happy, it was colorful, and then when he was at the residential school, it was all dull and muted colors.
Yeah.
Jeff Lemire is actually a renowned graphic novel artist. Mm.
This picture here, so moving.
Mhm.
I said this picture here, so moving because it's like he's laying outside on the tracks and he feels like this hand on his head and it's supposed to be like the spirit of his dad.
Mhm.
Basically like what I got from that, it's like his dad saying like it's gonna be okay.
Mhm.
Keep
Even
going.
just, there was another small act of kindness that happened in the story, and it was when he got the matches from the family that he met while he was on the road, and I found it interesting that it was the matches that allowed him to see his father and give him that little hope that things were gonna be okay from that one small act of kindness.
Mm-hmm. And then obviously earlier we talked about the in the indigenous school, like where you see the hand reach out and that's when he's going to be
Mhm.
assaulted.
Mhm.
So we see like the hand is still looming over him as he's walking. He's just thinking
Mhm.
about it. Or when the crow brings a set of eyeballs. That was kind of freaky.
Yeah, especially when they were doing it as part of their Halloween celebration, I think. Which I was surprised that they were allowed to celebrate Halloween at all in a Catholic school, but
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. I'm like, so okay. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
I feel like this book has encouraged me to read more about residential schools and other Indigenous issues that are affecting Indigenous people. I'm definitely going to go look into more books and see what else I can find out there.
Well, I mean, I got you.
You got me? Because you're learning about it in school.
I need to even see if I still have the online textbook from last semester, because this semester is going to be something different.
I'll show you maybe this is what maybe you read this in school, but I'll show you the one that I read. It's called Canada's First Nations and Cultural Genocide, which is what I read after I finished reading The Secret Path. Like only 80 pages, but I feel like it gave me a good background on what's going on.
We had like a textbook, but it was like online.
Yeah.
And then we had to read the Truth and Reconciliation. And with the Truth and Reconciliation, there are calls of action, and those calls of action are like actually really helpful. Like we should use these calls of action throughout everyday life to like help one another.
So give an example of what a call to action would be.
Let me pull some up. Truth, reconciliation, calls to action. Okay, so there's 94 of them. So let me pull up some. Okay, so
don't read all 94.
No. I'm just gonna pick random ones. So for education, it says we call upon the federal government to develop with Aboriginal groups a joint strategy to eliminate educational and employment gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. One of the ones for language is we call upon the federal government to acknowledge that Aboriginal rights include Aboriginal language rights. Or we call upon all levels of government to enable residential school survivors and their families to reclaim names changed by the residential school system by waiving administrative costs for a period of 5 years for the name change process and the revision of official identity documents such as birth certificates, passports, driver's license, health cards, status cards, and social insurance numbers. So that's like a huge one for what we're talking about now. I don't remember exactly where it is, but more to pertain is like my field of study. There's a call of action for like mental health groups and for like different health groups to take into account and use the ways of healing and stuff of the Indigenous people. So not just Western ideas of medication and Western processes, but use the Indigenous people's ways of doing things, like incorporate it, especially when you're dealing with those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes more sense. You should always involve people in creating legislation when it's directly going to affect them.
For realsies.
For realsies. Yeah, and like I said, residential schools are just one issue that's affecting Indigenous people today. There's also the fact that a lot of people in Canada who live on reserves don't have access to clean drinking water. There's also the high suicide rates amongst Indigenous youth all over Canada in terms of like Indigenous people. Yeah, and then there's also lack of access to education and just like everyday materials that you need to survive. The government does a good job of hiding all these issues too.
It's true.
Oh, this is gonna sound really ignorant, but I'm gonna say this. I think the most exposure I've ever had to Indigenous people as a kid was Pocahontas. Like that was the only image I ever had of Native Americans while growing up.
There are the missing girls,
And there's also the missing girls and women's and Indigenous community. Like they have that highway in BC, I think that's called the highway of tears, I think, because of the high number of Indigenous women who've gone missing along that stretch of road.
for my Indigenous class, we actually had to watch a Nathan Fillion documentary about that.
There's Nathan. Oh, he did a documentary on that. It's interesting. Send me that. Send me a link when you have time.
If I can find it.
Yeah.
I have to figure out what the name was.
I can just look it up too, like Nathan Fillion, Indigenous documentary. Do you want to wrap it up?
We have to go through our housekeeping items. So our next show is going to be on January 31st.
Mm-hmm.
January 31st, and we will be going over the story, which is Rena. Let me get the correct name right. It's called Rena, A Father's Story. It's written by her father, Manjeet Virg. Oh, you can't even see that. Oh, well.
Yeah,
it's called Rena, A Father's Story by Manjeet Virg.
Mm-hmm.
And Divi will be joining us. I can already say that this will be better than our last one because Divi and I are finding it a lot easier to read, and I know that you've already found it good. You've read it. I'm almost done. I'm like one chapter away from being done.
Yeah, not to say that like I love this story. I love the way that he wrote about his daughter, and he did a good job about explaining what happened to her. It's a story of a child who got almost bullied to death in BC. And it's a heartbreaking story. I think we're gonna have a good time talking about it with you guys. So, and I'm looking forward to having Divi on here again too. She's always fun to have around.
She most definitely is. Okay, so we got that coming up. The one after that is going to be on Valentine's Day, and that's going to be Sleepless. It is a graphic novel. Make sure to follow Shanja at Books Bounty 28. If you don't already follow me, Fresh Princess 92. Also, I need to plug me and Divi's Ting right now. Go check us out at The Melanin Marvels. We got our latest video up. We're here on YouTube. Go to The Melanin Marvels, as well as Instagram, The Melanin Marvels. And we're on Spotify, Google Podcast, Breaker, Anchor, all that business now. So come at us. Oh, Vicky, you read Rena? Or you know the story of Rena? Like, at parts of the story, I really don't like Rena, but she did not deserve that. But that is.
But you also have to remember. You also have to remember it's her father telling his version of the story, right? Rena's not here to tell her why she did certain things or why she said certain things, right? It's like it's the father's perspective.
It's the father's perspective. He's still trying to protect his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, like, for any story, you don't know all the background. You can only like pass judgment on the facts that you're given, and like the facts that are given.
But it makes a difference when the facts are being given by someone who is not the main victim or the main subject of the story, though. Well, not to say I'm saying there's something that she does in the story that.
That's the thing. There's things that she did which I don't agree with. That being said, she never deserved the outcome.
Yeah.
Like she was actually actively trying to make amends. She was doing better with her life, and then her life ended.
Yeah, and we also have to remember she's like what, 14?
She was 14 when she died.
14 years old, and to go through this level of mental trauma And bullying, especially when it happens over a couple years too, can really mess with someone's mental health, right?
That's the thing. I feel
And she was clearly acting out.
from my educated or semi-educated guess, it was more than just bullying. She 100% had mental health issues that tacked on to everything that happened to her, made things not go that well.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like we need to be saving some of this for our next podcast.
Listen to some podcasts. Yeah, definitely not. Definitely not.
I feel like Vic likes true crime.
Well, I mean, the girl was a forensics major. Of course.
Like, definitely getting that vibe here.
She knew about the Highway of Tears.
She knew about the Saskatoon murder.
She knew about Rena. Tell you, my friends are smart.
But yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up. It was nice talking to everyone. We had a good time. And
a DC channel.
DC channel.
You mean because it's Melanin Marvels? Well, what sounds like DC? Dicks Are Us.
You just not to say that.
Disastrous Christopher's channel.
We only just gave like a little bit of the story though. A little bit. I feel like we didn't spoil it. A lot of shit happens to her, but how did I know?
True crime.
Oh, and everyone, go look at this cute shirt that Anika's gonna get for her birthday. Well, should have gotten for her birthday, but didn't come in time. You'll get it when you get it.
It's the Dora Milaje.
All right. It was nice talking to everyone. Thanks for joining in, and thanks for always supporting us.
Yeah, I didn't see no Sean this time, but he's probably busy. It's okay. We still love you, Sean.
Yeah, we still love you, Sean.
You're still one of our number one fans. You share the platform of number one fan. Anyways, people, we out. Catch you on the flip side. Glad that you guys came to stop by. Hope to see you guys in the near future and that you support all of our platforms and all of our things. Hold on. Divvy wants to know where you found the shirt.
I'll send her the link.
She'll send you the link. All right, people. It's nice knowing you. We are the Brown Girls in the Rain, and this was our 10th episode of our book club. See you later.
Arrivederci. Au revoir.